We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. The Song of Moses is a poem that is recorded in Deuteronomy 32 1-43 in the Old Testament. The Bible tells us that just before Moses' death on Mount Nebo, God met with Moses and Joshua, Deuteronomy 31 16-18, who was going to lead the Israelites after Moses' death. And the Lord told them that after Moses' departure, the people of Israel would have to go back to the covenant that God had made with them. The Lord told Moses to write down the words of a song to teach the people God's ways, so that it may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. Moses did as he was told. And then he spoke in the hearing of all the assembly of Israel the words of the song until they were ended. Deuteronomy 31:30. In the portion of the song in this lesson, Moses contrasted the faithful God with disobedient and unfaithful Israel. This song offers prophetic insight into Israel's history, and its purpose was to teach. He likened the song to dew and rain, which eventually cause life to grow and mature. The effects of rain are seen only gradually as the water continues to nurture the plants. Our lesson comes from chapter 32. Our first verse says, "I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God." Moses was sure that his song would serve its teaching purpose by producing fruit, because he said, "I will proclaim the attributes and characteristics that make up the Father's nature." The hearers of the song are summoned to join him, recognize his greatness, strength, and magnificence. Moses wanted his teaching to be as nourishing as rain. Teaching that consistently extols the person of God will nourish the life and cause spiritual growth in the believer. Verse 4 says, "He is the rock, his works are perfect and all his ways are just." A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. God is described as a rock. A rock is solid and does not change. It has a firm foundation that can be stood upon. With God being a perfect rock, it makes him all the more great. You can stand upon the promises of God and know that he will fulfill every one of them. You can trust that he will provide for your every need. He is perfect at all times in everything he does. He never makes a mistake. The point Moses was making here is that the Israelites could be assured from this description of God's moral character that he would never change in his dealings with them. Verse 5 says, "They are corrupt and not his children, to their shame they are a warped and crooked generation." In contrast to their faithful God, the future generation of Israelites proved to be unfaithful and deceitful. The people's character was not the character of God's children. Instead of being trustworthy, they were deviating from what is considered moral or right or proper or good, and have a twisted character. The Israelites' moral perversity was enough to justify receiving God's severe discipline. Verse 6 says, "Is this the way you repay the Lord, you foolish and unwise people? Is he not your Father, your Creator, who made you and formed you?" Now Moses posed a series of questions to those who acted so treacherously. The first question was, "Is this how you repay the Lord, you foolish and unwise people?" What a way to repay God for his faithfulness. The person who never bothers to consider the consequences of his spiritual decisions can only be called foolish. And the person who rejects the Lord's way after considering the consequences would appear to be even further lacking in understanding. The second question Moses asked was, "Is not he your Father who made you?" God's fatherly care for the Israelites was easily seen when he redeemed them out of Egypt and during the wilderness journeys. God's spiritual fatherhood is still based on redemption. In view of all of God's special concern and nurture for the Israelites, it was ungrateful and foolish for them to forsake him. The same thing can be said about us. Verse 10 says, "In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him, he guarded him as the apple of his eye." Verses 7 to 9 are not part of our printed text, but in those verses, Moses called on the Israelites to remember the days of old when God divided the nations into their different lands, when he divided all mankind. Moses even looked ahead to when God would divide the land of Canaan among the tribes of Israel. Then he reminded the people that they were God's portion, they belonged to him. Now here in verse 10, Moses said that for nearly 40 years, God led his people around in the wilderness, which resulted from their disobedience, unbelief, and constant complaining. God was angry with their attitude and allowed an entire generation to die in the desert, and not enter his promised rest. Meanwhile he taught them his laws, and protected them like the apple of his eye. Describing Israel this way, showed just how important they were to the Lord. Verse 11 says, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. Still describing how the Father protected his people, Moses likened God's care for Israel to the care an eagle shows for her young. In essence, he said that God is like an eagle when she makes her young leave the nest to fly. She stays close to them, ready to help, and spreads her wings to catch them when they fall, and carries them to a safe place, and so does the Lord to his people. By using this imagery of an eagle teaching her young to fly, Moses' song emphasized both God's protection and guidance of his people. The Lord had brought them out of Egypt and was now ready to send them out on their own into the promised land. Verse 12 says, the Lord alone led him, no foreign God was with him. God had carried his people out of Egypt, led them into the wilderness, and now for 40 years he had led them through it. God didn't need any assistance, nor did he take anyone to be partners with him in this achievement. This was a good reason why they should serve the Lord only, and no one or nothing else. In addition, Moses said God had no idol with him to help with Israel's deliverance, and therefore, there should be no one or nothing to share Israel's honor and adoration for the Lord. Verse 13 says, he made him ride on the heights of the land and fed him with the fruit of the fields. He nourished him with honey from the rock and with oil from the flinty crag. Now Moses' song speaks about Israel's future after they entered Canaan. The Israelites will enjoy glorious victories they would have over their enemies and afterwards enjoy the safety on the heights of the land where they could eat the fruit of the fields in peace. The last part of this verse tells about the abundance and satisfaction the land would provide for God's people. He promised to bring them into a land full of agricultural blessings. This appears to be what God meant by the phrase, and he made him to suck honey out of the rock, and oil out of the flinty rock. Verse 14 says, with curds and milk from herd and flock and with fattened lambs and goats, with choice rams of Bashan and the finest kernels of wheat. You drank the foaming blood of the grape. Moses continued his song focusing more on the abundance of food the people would have in the land. Livestock like cows would produce enough milk to make butter and even cheese. God would provide his people with the best sheep, lambs, goats and rams from Bashan, which was known for having the best rams. God would also bless his people with the fat of kidneys of wheat, which was the best wheat and excellent for making bread. The last part of this verse says the people will enjoy unfermented, pure red juice of grapes. Our final verse says, you deserted the rock, who fathered you, you forgot the God who gave you birth. Even after being faithful to his people by keeping his word to bring them into the promised land with all of its blessings, the people still found it easy to be unmindful or not to think about God. Moses said that they had even forgotten God that formed them. God would prevent sin, but when the world is served and the flesh indulged, God is forgotten, and can anything be lower and more unworthy than to forget the God that is the author of our being, by whom we exist and in whom we live and move? Being unmindful and forgetting God can lead to only one thing, the day of grief and of desperate sorrow. Israel would later learn this lesson. Song of Moses. Jewish people have always given an important place to music in their public worship just as Christians have. For Jews, music has provided an emotional outlet for their praise to God. It enables them to recall words to the long scripture passages that were sung in the temple. In addition, the message sung is seldom forgotten, so the music would continue to go through the minds of both singers and hearers for a long time to come, bringing the words of God to mind. The Song of Moses was intended for those reasons, just as spiritual songs are today. God commanded Moses to write the song, Deuteronomy 31:19. He was to teach it to the children of Israel because a song would tend to remain in their minds after God's commandments had been forgotten. Moses' song was intended to remind the Israelites of God's faithfulness and to call them back to their covenant commitments. Our music today should serve the same purposes. Song of Moses. 1. When we are consumed with difficulties, we should recognize that God's greatness is unlimited and we should turn to Him before we do anything else. Deuteronomy 32:3. A decision to acknowledge God is the first step in deciding to believe in God's promises, which soon lead to being blessed and growing in faith, obedience, and victory. 2. God always renders just judgment to everyone because He possesses the attributes of truth and justice. Deuteronomy 32:4. As God is just and loving, so we are called to do justice and live in love. 3. When believers stray from God, His concern for them is like the concern of a father for his children. Deuteronomy 32:5-6. He knows what it is like to be a parent. Express your concerns to Him and then leave them at His altar. He will replace your worries with peace. 4. God's people are so important to Him that He proves His faithfulness every time He cares for and protects His own, just like an eagle cares for and protects her own. Deuteronomy 32:10-12. It's comforting to know that God has promised to protect His people. 5. As believers, after God has truly blessed us, the worst thing we can do is forget about Him and all He has done for us. Deuteronomy 32:13-14, 18. It is all well and good to consider yourself faithful, but what matters is how you actually live, remembering what God does for us. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.